Welcome, everybody. We've got a great webinar today, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Kylie, for setting it up. Glad to be here, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Burke. I'm founder and CEO of Verivest Fund Services. Today, and we've been doing a series of webinars with folks in and around the private fund business and always engaging with different topics and so forth. So today we have Derrick Foote as a CPA from Southern California with Dunner and Foote. Derrick and I have known each other now for several years and a lot of mutual clients, and thought we'd have Derrick on to chat about some interesting stuff. So, Derrick, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Veribest, for inviting me and putting this together. It's great to be on this webcast and get to talk about private lending and share a little bit about what we do. We're a boutique CPA firm here in Irvine, Southern California. We're full service. I would say 65 to 70% of our business is in the private lending space. So we really enjoy working with guys like everybody in the private lending space. And uh, we're I've been doing this for 25 years. There's a Dunner on the name. David Dunner's now on a golf course, but he started this firm 35 years ago and kind of specialized in the private lending space, so we carried that on.
So it's really just Foote at this point, what you're saying.
Exactly, exactly. If it wasn't for all these regulatory bodies and licensing that I'd have to change, then maybe it would just be Foot LLP. But for now,
Yeah,
we're
we'll
signed up
go.
with all these regulatory bodies as Dunner and Foot, so we're going to stay that way for a little
We'll go
while.
with that. So yeah, we met in the Derek's referring to private lending. So a good chunk of our client base are real estate fund manager, real estate
Mhm.
mortgage pool fund managers. We also do a lot of other things, real estate, so private funds just generally. But that's really where we focus. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the things that go on in the CPA world, some of the important back office stuff, the kind of role of the CPA in the private funds, audits, valuation, some best practices around third party valuation and so forth. So we'll kind of get into some of the industry shifts and so forth. So, but before we do that, Derrick, just give us a little bit about yourself. To sort of how did you get into this field? Why private funds? Why private lending? Sort of how did that evolve to give people some context around yourself?
Sure. So I spent almost 20 years at two large national firms and was kind of climbing their ladder, looking to be partner in kind of the traditional format of working my way through a significant firm. At some point, I fielded a phone call, and they introduced me to David, said he's looking to transition. I took the phone call. I met with him. He explained kind of his business and what he was doing and his core concentrations. And at the time, I'd been specializing in private equity and working with a lot of private equity funds and their portfolio companies. And as I talked to David and I got a better understanding of his business, it just sounded exciting, and I never thought I would change gears like I did when I fielded that phone call 6 years ago. But I decided at that point, I was interested in becoming an entrepreneur and no longer kind of climbing the corporate ladder and kind of building something out. And I really liked, his concentration and his commitment to the private lending space. And it was very similar to what I'd been doing with respect to private equity and kind of, the partnership agreements, the waterfalls, the PPMs, and understanding all that. And it kind of, a lot of times at smaller firms, they might not have a core concentration in a specific industry or the industry niche may not be as exciting. And after hearing him out, I decided to kind of shift gears and change where I was going and how I was doing things and decided to become his retirement policy and an entrepreneur
Yes.
shortly
So what?
thereafter.
Talk a little more about that. What's that like? I was at a fund services conference. It was put on by a New York-based fund formation firm, and there was a lot of people, and there was 60 of us there, and there was a lot of people just in the fund services business, including a lot of CPAs, a lot of the big firms, the big four. There was some of the mid-tier. I know there's been a ton of changes in the accounting world. Private equity's now gotten heavily into the CPA world and so forth. Why don't you give us? I know I encounter it a lot with clients around. Hey, we need a CPA, we need an auditor. Who should I work with? Maybe give us your perspective on some of the differences between the big firms that you worked out, the small firm, which you are kind of in between, private equity shop. Just talk about the whole fund services space for in the CPA world these days.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. What I noticed is, I took over David Dunner's practice in 2019. So I had a year before the world turned upside down with COVID. So I immediately got stress test with respect to COVID and just all the disruption that occurred. What I noticed just locally within my marketplace is a lot of smaller firms or regional firms that the chaos from that and the change then the change from that. I saw seven firms decide to sell that were kind of, I would say, maybe slightly competitors. I mean, I'm a boutique firm of 10 people. These were regional and local shops that just decided, hey, once COVID came around, it was time to pack it up. So there was a significant leading up to when COVID hit, there was a significant amount of transactional type of activity that turned into this that happened in the CPA world. And now I'm seeing more of that. It's kind of continued to work. So apparently those 7 or 8 transactions I saw during COVID have all worked out because now I'm seeing more of that. And what I'm seeing is more private equity type money coming in. We're seeing some of the bigger firms go to private equity and go to this alternative practice structure. Now, I grew up in an alternative practice structure environment. So I saw that firsthand when RSM was acquired by H&R Block. And as much as and RSM is now private and owned by their partners. So at some point, the older partners look for a transition, they look for a soft landing, so they look for these private equity deals. And that's great for them. But then for a lot of the emerging partners and kind of and newer talent, now they instead of being a traditional partner, they have a silent partner that they have to work with, which could
Yeah.
be some of these private equities. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 5 or 7 years when some of these emerging leaders realize they're with a silent partner. So you could see more of an entrepreneurial shift within the CPA world, um, which is
Yeah.
which will be interesting. Things are always changing. Like I grew up at RSM and I grew up at CBIZ, which were two of the largest
Yeah.
alternative practice structure firms. CBIZ still is, and they're kind of the model that everybody's following and everybody's looking at. And private equity loves the CPA business because it's their first of all, as you look at bigger firms, Matt, and
Yep.
you remarked in this meeting you saw that you had other CPA firms, CPA
CBiz,
firms like
CBiz was there.
yeah, they like to put their hands in all these different pots, and I'm not saying they do them all well, but if you look back at the '90s where they had, um, they were into the banking industry, and obviously that changed with Sarbanes-Oxley and Circular 230. A lot of these CPA firms, the private equities look at them and look, hey, we can come in and we can expand the suite of services and increase
Yeah.
market share and continue to perform these roll-ups. CBiz was the first kind of, I'm not saying the first, but in my mind, one of the biggest roll-up
Yeah.
firms where they're going out. And now we've seen Markham and now, private equities trying to replicate the same formula. So, it'll be interesting to see how the dynamic changes. You're going to see a lot of firms becoming bigger and bigger. And then when the emerging leaders then become at maybe a partner level, we're going to see if they truly like that structure, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't benefit from it at the get-go. And how are those synergies going to work? Because firsthand, when I was at RSM, I heard the partners, rub, kind of rub elbows with H&R Block.
Yeah.
They wanted to do one thing, and H&R Block said, well,
Do something else. Yeah.
yeah, we want to do something else.
What
So
what is the practical like from a client standpoint? So like people on the call largely, managers, aspiring managers, like what is the practical implication to those people? I know that over the years, hiring different CPAs to do work. Sometimes, I mean, you get the big four, you got a lot of the, let's call it 5 through 20, and then there's a ton of other firms. Like, how do you view the impact, like on audits and tax work and so forth for fund managers being affected by all this?
Well, I think, as these firms become bigger and bigger, and there's more overhead, there's generally going to be more fees, right? So you look at it that from that standpoint, there's more fees. But then you also, from a positive standpoint, you're like, if that firm's becoming bigger, it's becoming more noticeable, and maybe other investors may find that more uh, reputable. That hey, this firm's got a big
Yeah.
name, and also they may be able to offer more resources. I'm not, because of how many different businesses they're in, versus a smaller firm. My name isn't as well known as you as a bigger
But
firm.
run
I
into
can't
that a
offer the
lot on the admin side, right? There's
yeah,
like kind of the big four, and everybody knows who, E and Y
sure.
is and
Uh,
PwC, but like people don't know who Dunner and Foote is, right? Or
Yeah,
people,
absolutely. And that stamp can mean a lot when you're looking at institutional investors.
yeah,
They like to know, hey, we've heard of that firm before. We've worked with them. We know their insurance policy just from an E&O standpoint.
yeah,
Um, so we feel, we know they're specialists. Whereas sometimes for me, when I need a specialist, I need to go outside my firm or my
yeah,
my network or go to
yeah,
my network, I should say. And so the specialist I may work with on a particular client matter will be at his or her own shop rather than in-house. So that's a different feel.
yeah,
Also, from my standpoint, we work with a lot of emerging funds. Some of the bigger
yeah.
companies, they can't make that investment because of their
Yeah.
overhead. They can't work with a fund manager at a certain level.
That's right. Yeah, I think if I summarize it right, the bigger they get, the more expensive they get. They have more resources, and maybe the bigger and more institutional the fund gets, the more they need something like that. But for a lot of
Absolutely.
smaller, medium-sized emerging managers, you're going to get priced out of it, and necessarily the return, the
Mhm.
services that you're getting, you don't necessarily need all of that. Let's talk a little bit, Derek, about like audits and valuations. I know that for a lot of people, they question, do they need an audit? Is there a requirement to get an audit as a fund manager? If so, when and why? And sort of what's your view on when does somebody need an audit? Why do they need an audit? And what should they be thinking about if they're getting an audit for their fund?
I think the first thing is why we see a lot of our clients come for audits is one, they're getting ready to develop a banking relationship. They want to add leverage to their fund. So they may get an audit from that standpoint. Another is, within their PPM, it may be written in. The attorney may have included it based on the type of investors they're trying to attract. What I'll see is once the fund exceeds $10 million, they're required to have an audit just to have a third party take a look at their numbers and give the partner some additional comfort. That may be from the attorney or from the investors that they know they're going to be working with. The investors may call for it. And what we're seeing more and more now is a lot of funds are working with these registered investment advisors. And generally, they like to see a historical number of audits before they decide to put them on their platform and start working with them. So as we start to work with funds, I think I'm seeing the registered investment advisor reason a lot more these days
Yeah,
as funds go out to solicit and bring in investors. So that's what I'm seeing a lot and what the calls we're getting because people are looking at that. From what I understand, you know, everybody's different, like Charles Schwab or Morgan Stanley. But what I hear generally is maybe a couple or 2 years of kind of audits so
yeah,
that they can identify, hey, there's a pattern here. These guys have been looked at more than 1 year.
yeah.
We feel more comfortable putting them on our platform and soliciting these units to our clients.
What sort of price range can people be looking at for an audit? And I know it'll vary depending on the size and so forth, but like just can you give us an idea of range of cost and what influences how much an audit costs? Is it number of assets, size of the number of
It's
investors?
Sure. It's size of the fund. It's the overall performance of the portfolio. If we have to look at the trust deeds and look at, there's some non-performing or REOs, that's going to be that's going to factor into our pricing. Also, another thing is who's doing their accounting? Are they working with someone like fund admin or Verivest? Can we feel confident that the accounting
Yeah,
uh, is is correct. There are audits where we take on and then we get into the weeds and we're like, well, wait a minute, there's a lot that needs to be
Yeah.
done here.
Yeah.
And one thing we'll see is partnership contributions booked as debt and things of that nature, and debt and equity getting confused. I saw that just last year where when we pulled the subscription agreements, we got debt agreements, so they weren't even classified appropriately. So,
Yeah.
can we feel confident that who their accounting partner is, or whether it's done internally or externally with like a Verivest, can we feel confident that when we come in, we 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 know that things are being recorded in the right place, and then really we look at the kind of the trust deeds and the overall performance. So that's what our first approach is, and kind of understanding how the assets are performing and who their partners are.
Yeah. And I know that you referenced the idea in the private lending space of REOs, taking properties back in foreclosure, what price
Mhm.
you're taking. Does it cover the unpaid principal balance? How you treat
Absolutely.
the valuation. Let's talk about valuations a little bit, because my understanding is in the private fund world, valuation can be a super critical piece of things, especially if it's an open-ended fund and you're basing the unit price on those valuations. Like, what's your thoughts around, some of the valuations? Do they need to get third party? Can they do it internally? We just talk about that a little bit.
Generally, if it depends whether the asset's performing or non-performing, right? If the asset's performing, we'll look at maybe some of the content that's readily available. Um,
And you're
Out.
specifically referring to debt right now, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So debt. So debt, if it's performing, we're gonna look at just what's readily available out there via the internet. If it's non-performing, we're gonna ask for appraisals or BPOs. If we're really concerned about the asset, we're gonna be more adamant that we want to see a third-party appraisal rather than a BPO
yeah,
to get comfortable with the value. And then, of course, with REOs, we're generally looking for appraisals. So if there are REOs at the on the books at the end of the year, we want to see appraisals and get comfortable that that the fund isn't in a position where it needs to record an additional reserve associated with that asset.
yeah. What about valuations in non-debt funds like equity funds and real estate, et cetera? Because I know if you're buying a value add property, right? You paid X for it and you added some improvements to it, and then you leased it up, and then the valuation can easily, it's highly subjective, really, what the valuation is at any given moment on any given asset. How do you deal with that?
It is initially we'll do our internal research. Generally, when we're doing or gearing up for performing an audit, we're trying to meet with all our clients right now. So what we can identify what issues or what concerns we have so that we can hopefully rectify them before year end. So for instance, if we're looking at a group of assets like that, we're doing our independent research and kind of stress testing the portfolio from our standpoint. And then if we think there's an issue, we're going to request an appraisal or do so leading up to year end so that the fund manager is aware, knows what they need to get done so that we can hopefully issue the audit as soon as possible.
Yeah, and by the way, everybody, if you have questions along the way, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them here at the end. On the back to the audit conversation or the valuation conversation, for the purposes of an audit, Derek, I mean, I know I've seen this a lot where people don't really appreciate what's being audited and how they're treating this. How do people prepare best for an audit to keep the costs down and to keep the friction down? Process. I know, like, meeting with them, like you said, at the end of the year, but are there any best practices that you can advise people on how to best prepare for an audit?
I think meeting at in Q4, late Q3, so that we understand where everything's at and what needs to take place leading up to year end. It's tough to it's what happens is if those meetings don't happen and they happen in January after year end, it's tough to clean up things or change things or be
Yeah,
prepared, and also to have your accounting records right in
yeah,
good
exactly.
order. The example I gave where people were booking debt rather than equity, and they were mix matching their subscription agreements and their debt agreements, and you know, um, at that point, maybe you want to talk to an accounting partner and have them work with you so that your books are in good order. There were a couple instances where, people leading up to last year, people were a little bit messier than they anticipated, and they didn't even know where they were at. So it's good to have those conversations with your auditor. There were at least two clients where, hey, we'll have everything to you January 31st. Then it became like April. They were so far behind the eight ball. And I think if they would have had a good accounting partner, uh, they would have possibly met that deadline in January. When we started talking with them, we realized they were so far behind the eight ball, and that put a lot of pressure on the manager, just from a standpoint of optics with their investors and investors asking when the return's going to be done or when the audit report's going to be done. So, having a good accounting partner is definitely helpful in making sure everything's in good order leading up to year end. Because after year end, to try to hustle through it, it just doesn't happen.
Uh, Very tough. I know that for a lot of small, emerging, kind of mid-sized managers, it can be really tough to build the infrastructure needed to kind of stand up to the audit and ultimately to build a fund that is really, you can engender a lot of confidence with investors. But what do you think people can do to kind of really, as best they can, create something that engenders confidence with investors, stands up to an audit? And you have any best practices that you can recommend?
I think really just, look at the accounting aspect of it. Put together that team and the back office that's going to be there to help you, to answer your questions, to get things prepared in a timely manner. Um, the hard part is making decisions when accounting is 2 or 3 or 4 months behind and kind of not knowing where you are at. So I think having that good partner, having your books and records up to date, and in a timely manner is definitely helpful. So that when we come in and we start planning and working with you in in Q4 or any audit partner that you've decided to work with, that we can hit the ground running and start providing advice and giving you an understanding of how things are looking from our perspective, so that if there can be changes or decisions made leading up to your end to get you to where you want to get. The last thing you want to do is find out, have an auditor book an adjustment and find out, well, wait a minute, our pref was this, and now our distributions, we're distributing that pref. Now that's lower. Our income's lower than what our distributions were. So we
Now
kind
it's a
of had
return
a
of capital.
yeah. And that's the last thing you want to find out in February or March because a journal entry was made because something was incorrectly booked or not considered. So having your books and records up to date and talking about that and making sure you're going to hit your pref, or there's going to be maybe a waterfall distribution shortly after year end is paramount to kind of creating investor confidence and providing good data to people.
Yeah, I find that a lot of real estate people and mortgage pool people, they're really good at the real estate side. That's what got them in the business in the first place. And then they become excited about that business and they understand it intimately. But the accounting treatment can be very difficult and tricky. And people grasp all of the implications of all that, especially in a pooled fund format. So it's easy to kind of get down the road a little bit, not doing it exactly the way that it needs to be done, and only discovering at some future point that you didn't do what you needed to do, and then unwinding that becomes a real problem. I'm sure you've seen that.
Oh, absolutely. There's plenty of instances where that's happened, and it generally will happen to newer fund managers that don't completely understand what needs to be done. And, as a new fund manager, you're running around trying to find, find investors, make good loans. Uh, our thought is let someone else help you and solve that problem. And then when time comes when you want to work with someone like us or think about the audits, everything's in good order, and we can start start as soon as possible and getting
Yeah.
things done for you.
And I know you're heavily steeped in the private lending space. Are you doing some other types of funds, like some pref equity funds, some real estate funds? Like, what are you guys active in that market? Like, what's kind of your ideal client profile that you're looking for?
So right now we're mostly focused on debt funds, but as we continue to grow, we're starting to see more and more real estate funds coming our way, just by the nature of the space we play in and some of the people introduced to. As
Mhm.
those real estate funds work with some of our debt funds or work with some of our partners that are in the private lending space, we get introduced to some of their clients that are borrowing from them, that are looking for a firm with our expertise or our commitment to this space. So, uh, just by nature of, having the opportunity to work with so many good lenders, we're seeing more and more real estate funds as we continue to grow our practice.
Yeah, yeah, and your private equity background really suits for that type of structure, correct? I mean, because that's a lot more similar to a private equity structure on the direct real estate side, because you're owning the asset itself as opposed to lending against it.
Absolutely. Understanding, the various structures, the PPMs, operating agreements. I leverage what I learned when I was focused on the private equity side with respect to helping our real estate funds.
Anybody got any questions? I don't see any open questions on here. So if not, we're gonna kind of we're at the bottom of the hour. I'm gonna get wrapping up here. So Derrick, where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you and reach out to talk about your services?
Well, I appreciate that, Matt. As you pulled up my emails, Derrick Foote at Dunner CPA, and you can also find me and my team on our website at Dunner CPA. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions or inquiries, and I'd be happy to help you out or provide some direction from an accounting perspective or tax. So, we appreciate all inquiries, and I urge you, if you have any questions, to reach out to me and I'll get back to you and we can schedule a call.
Yeah, and I'd say we've done a lot of work. We have a lot of mutual clients with Derrick, and I'd say he's super knowledgeable on the private space. So if you're a newer emerging mid-sized fund manager out there and you don't necessarily need the imprimatur of a Ernst and Young or a top 4 or 10 CPA, Derrick is a great option. We do have a question here, Derrick. Says, when looking at any of the internally or externally developed valuations, how do you get comfortable with those valuations? Can you rely on in-house expertise, or do you work with third-party providers? Is a combination of both? And when would you
It's
choose
a
one?
combination of both. It depends on the asset.
Yeah.
Um, we're as I mentioned, if the assets non-performing, we're going to
Right.
push for third party, right? So that we have something else to hang our hat on, and it's unrelated, and we generally think that it's arm's length. But we see plenty of valuations. So if it is built out internal, generally the asset's going to be performing, and we may have some questions, and we will do our independent research. We may pull comps within that particular area to get comfortable with the valuation that's been prepared in-house.
Yeah, and I would add to it that my experience, you tell me what you think of this, Derek, is that it's acceptable for the manager to have an internal valuation. There's no absolute legal requirement usually to get a third party valuation. But the more you're relying on internal valuations, the more you should have a well developed and articulated and written policy on how you're approaching those valuations. So I always recommend to clients develop a stated value methodology for whatever type of assets that you have that's based on widely acceptable valuation methods in the marketplace for whatever type of asset is. If it's like in the lending business, if it's a loan, it's generally the unpaid principal balance, plus accrued interest, if any, as long as the thing is not impaired. But once it gets impaired, then it becomes a different calculation, right? How impaired is it? Is the asset, is the value of the real estate that secures the loan less than the value of the loan? If so, by how much, right? You can set aside loan loss reserves and so forth. If you're investing directly in real estate and you're doing value add real estate, it might be the cost basis for some period of time. until
Mhm.
you reach stabilization on the asset, at which point maybe you're using NOI, capitalized at some market rate, cap rate that you can use comps for. Maybe it's a sales comparison approach. It could be a combination of all those. But the more that you lay out exactly how you're doing it in writing, and then you follow that and you document how and why you did it, the easier it is for Derrick to be
Mhm.
able to say in an audit that, okay, I'll stand by that because, here's all the evidence that shows how you did it. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. If it's consistent, if it's well thought out, if it's memorialized, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah, and I would say just for new managers though, that even to know to do that is hard, and then to be able to
Mhm.
actually have the discipline and the resources to do that consistently. But that's what it takes to become a really good manager, is to build out that kind of infrastructure and discipline. Um, Another question, it looks like it's similar, but approaching internal valuation policy for direct equity and resident construction projects, various stages of construction have not achieved stabilization. At what point do you determine and rely on third party? It's a similar answer to that question,
Mhm.
I think, is that, you can have what makes sense, I guess, is the question. If it's a development project, it's probably the cost basis all the way through certification of occupancy, and even while you're in lease up phase, right? Because until it's
Mhm.
leased up, you don't really have the income there to show the income capitalization, the
Yeah.
direct capitalization approach to value. So it just what's logical and sensible in terms of the timing.
And are we making a fair market value election on the financial statements? Right. So are we booking it up? And then what does that look like? Generally with real estate, we are going to go with a fair market value election, and that definitely is something that's highly recommended if there's an open-ended fund, just because you have investors that are in at the beginning where the appreciation may take place, and then someone comes in later. So those are some things we consider and work with the managers on. So, especially when you're dealing with real estate.
Well, and there's a difference between whether it's an open-ended fund or a closed-ended fund. Are you doing the valuation for the purposes of determining the price at which future investors are buying in at? Or is it a fixed price, then everybody, and there's a true up, they're coming in and paying some sort of equalization or catch up
Sure.
at the beginning, at which point the fair market value is less meaningful. I mean, it's a nice to know for an investor to see how the fund is progressing, but it's not an out and out requirement in the sense that it's not driving what people are paying for the shares, right? So in those instances, there may be different ways of thinking about it, or even the necessity of
Sure.
going through and creating the value of the individual assets. Is that a
Absolutely. Yeah,
reasonable
I mean,
summary?
absolutely. Um, if you don't have to make the fair market value election or do the fair market value, then there's less work, right? And if it's close-ended, the fair market value may not be as pertinent.
That's right. So all of these are issues that managers, need to think about and deal with and make their own determination on how they're going to deal with it and whether they should structure it in a certain way or another. And this is all stuff that again, Verivest can help you with in our advisory practice. So be sure and let us know. Well, Derrick, appreciate the time today, man, and thanks for coming on. Appreciate all the clients we have together and the work that you do. And I look forward to doing many more here in the future. We'll see. I know you're attending a lot of the mortgage pool events, right? So people might see you down at
Absolutely.
CMA
Um,
or Apple or anywhere else, huh?
absolutely. We'll be at Apple next, so we'll have a booth, so feel free to stop by.
Yeah,
And
AAPL, American Association of Private Lenders Conference coming up here in November. It's what, like 3 weeks away.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
Matt and Verivest, thank you for having me on and putting this together.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Everybody, thanks for meeting with us. We'll see you guys next month. We have another excellent webinar coming up, so please join us here in November. And until then, have a good day.
Have
Thanks,
a good day.
everyone.
Take care. Thank you.